Hi guys. So this time actually I got to see Jonah's presentation before recording this one, so that's actually pretty great because then I can just add to what he presented on, which was a really good presentation. I just took my notes here, so I'm looking at them while I took my own notes. I was comparing them, right? So anyway, like thank you to Jonah for this great introduction an analysis, and there was also like a lot of good reflections on the themes of the text. So to add, there's the biographical side of Achy Obejas. I have not much to say. Again, this is not, even though it's more contemporary, this is still not exactly my specialty. A little bit because of gender studies, but yeah, but Cuban or American Cuban literature is not what I work on. But I do recognize it more or less, part of it, more from my own experience as an immigrant, right? And from the experience of people that I know. And then Jonah also like made a bunch of good points about this, right? This particularity of an immigrant who is also LGBTQ, who is also coming from Cuba, which makes it even more different than from any other country in Latin America, right? Like especially at the end when Jonah explained about the laws that will start in the 60s allow Cubans to become get refuge and become citizens rather easily as soon as they were able to land on the US, right? And there are many reasons for that, right? So this text deals with that a lot. And I liked also how Jonah made a point of comparing that to our current landscape. I haven't checked the laws lately. I will be surprised if that law, I mean, maybe it has changed, but up until a couple of years ago, the law that would make it like if you're a Cuban citizen and manage to touch land in the US, you get refuge. Like that was still the case for, because automatically, right? Like it's not like for other immigrants where like there's a process and so on. Like for Cubans, it was just straightforward. Many reasons for that, right? We can get into that in a second. But yeah, I just want to like piggyback in some of the things that Jonah mentioned, right? As I look at some quotes from our text, right? And I think something like very good that Jonah mentioned, and that it's for us, we have to keep in mind, right? It's this. There's a bunch of dichotomies here, right? Like, and the main one that we have historically, and Jonah did go into this a little bit, is the Cold War, right? Like the Cold War as precisely the moment where after World War II, we get these two ideologies like fighting for dominance of the world, like in terms of ideology, right? So capitalism incarnated by and liberal democracy by the U.S., right? Mainly, even though like you have also other countries as well, and then communism as it was instated by the USSR, right? The Soviet Union. Um, and a lot of like Ovejas goes into a lot of this in the text, right? Like even at the beginning, where it's like and John analyzed really well the narratological side of this text, right? Like how the present of the text is rather what would be the past for us, right? And then how everything else is rather a prolepsis, right? It's a fast forward to the future, right? Anyway, when we start in the present, right? Like the narrator makes it really clear when she says like we're evidence, right, that the revolution failed to the middle class, right? Like so part of the interest that the U.S. will have or the immigration officers will have in receiving these immigrants, right, is that they are literally used as evidence, like as evidence of this political structure or political struggle, right? If people are trying to escape Cuba, right, like it's a proof, it's an evidence literally that the communist government or dictatorship that Castro had was not working, right? Anyway, and then there is some kind of what is very interesting rather is like I don't like because of the point of view of the let alone Ovejas right now. Let's go away from author's kind of analysis, but just the point of view of the character, right? Like whose character is a girl who comes to Cuba this time, from Cuba to the U.S. like when she's very young, right? And then becomes more of young character, like later a woman who like goes through, you know, protesting the war in Vietnam and like embracing more like liberal or progressive values and so on, right? Because of that point of view, this, and the narrator is telling the story in the first person, right? Like we get these um, hindsight points of view, for example, when describing the Hungarian immigration officer who's like, you know, helping them, but also like sharing her experience also as a former communist citizen, right, or of a communist system. There is some tongue-in-cheek here parts where like this person is, or something that we hear is like how the family of this Hungarian lost a large country state with two legs, right? Like how dare they, how dare them take this large country state with two legs, right? Obviously, the joke there being a little bit that if you had a large country state with two legs, you probably were not like middle class. You were pretty much like aristocracy, or not at least really rich, right? Like, and the point here being that part of the communist and socialist attempt at the redistribution of wealth is that there is an exaggeration of concentration of wealth in some people, right? Like the idea of two legs, not one, but two legs. So anyway, there is that criticism there of like, yeah, we can criticize some parts of the communist regime as it was incarnated by Fidel, and the father is kind of the figure who does it the most, right? Although the father, we're gonna get into him in a second because he's a very, very complex figure, right? But also this idea of like, well, the revolution or these revolutions happened for a reason, right? Like, and it had to do in the case of Russia, of course, with the absolute disparity of wealth in the aristocracy and the folks, right? Like that's folk, the people, and countries like Hungary the same, right? Like, and in Cuba the thing is like, as you know from your history class and so on, right? Like before Fidel was there, you had Batista, who also was making the island, or had made the island pretty much a kind of like capitalistic paradise with casinos and stuff, right? So it was like a very economically divided place also, and it was also becoming pretty much like a amusement park for the rich, right? So, and that's kind of where the father kind of comes up, right? Like, because that is scene that Jonah mentioned about how the daughter will say like, don't keep saying that you know, you came here because of me, when like it was because you, right? Like you could not stand what was going to happen with you under this like new regime, right? And it's not because you were like unjustly like attacked or anything, and there's even like a suggestion there that it was because like the father knew Fidel, and Fidel had like beat him at a swimming race, right? Or there's something also about how when the father meets another Cuban, right, like another person who had emigrated to the U.S., how the father gets nervous when this new other person, this other Cuban says like, yeah, like I knew Fidel, but I also knew your father, right? Like some, cause it's kind of like the implication that there are some like older like scenes, right? Like the past of the father is not that clear, right? So it might be that the past of the father had to do with the oligarchs that were there in Cuba at the time, that were taking advantage of the people, right? So it also complicates a lot the question of nationalism, right? And the text is a lot about that, right? Like, and I would say about nationalism and identity, right? And Jonah remarked that really well as well. And I think especially in terms of the immigrant identity, right? Like I think the best thing where we see this is when the father is watching the Olympics, right? And even though he's like very critical of the government of Cuba and so on, he's just like, and the narrator like underlines this, right? He's just like as excited and as like, you know, elated and singing the national anthem and putting his hand like on his chest, just as Fidel would do, right? And something Jonah mentioned, but I wanted to underline, right? Like it's the suicide of the father, right? Or the attempt to commit suicide, because he doesn't die there. But his attempt of suicide is precisely because, or it comes precisely at the moment when the father finally realizes that his dream, that it keeps being this dream during all the time that we hear about him in his life in the U.S., when his dream of coming back to Cuba, when he realizes that dream is not going to happen, right? Which again kind of like questions a lot, or puts into a different light what is the experience of the immigrant to the U.S., right? Because as Jonah was mentioning about, talking about matters of identity, right? Um, Jonah said something interesting. He said, let me see. Yeah. So the idea of like you are who you are and you can't be changed is an American ideal, right? But I don't know if I agree with that. But besides that, there is the question of if America is a land of immigrants, right? It means that it's a land of different cultures, and it means that it's a land of different identities. Like it's kind of the land of different identities, right? Like precisely because it's made from people from different places, right? So the fact that the father becomes this kind of like right wing Republican Cuban from Miami, which is a stereotype that has its examples, like it's not that far away. Yet it's always like nostalgic about Cuba, right? Like it creates this question of like how when you become an American and when you embrace the American dream as an immigrant, right? Like part of that identity is an identity of having a land you came from that is not America, right? Part of the dream of America as a land of immigrants is the idea of what makes you ultimately an American is that you did not come you originally from here, right? So even when you talk about further generations, right, like Achy Obejas being one, you still will also talk about like how the identity of the American is always described as identity of where the people came from, right? It's always like for 3, 4, 5 generations and so on. There's always this idea of like, oh, my people came from like Cuba or Mexico or Germany or Ireland, right? Like or Egypt, Tunisia, Asia, and so on, right? Like there's always like this idea of an American always has this double identity, right? Which creates a complex kind of thing here, right? So the other part that I wanted to go a little bit here is not only the sexuality part, which is interesting, right? Like with the character being bisexual and kind of like pointing at these moments of sexuality as kind of the most intimate moments for like her identity, right? But also like how it's linked with religion, right? Like that beautiful scene where the Colombian woman actually starts reading to her in Spanish, right, so that she understands. In comparison with the other Catholic person who's trying to like also talk to her about religion and the Bibles and so on, right? So when the Colombian girl starts reading in English, right? Sorry, in Spanish. What she reads is the Song of Solomon, right? Like, and Song of Solomon being one of the parts of the Bible that is, it's a beautiful part. It's one of the most poetic ones, but it's also one of the most romantic, kind of intimate ones, right? The quote being like, "Your breasts are like two fawns, twins of a gazelle that feed upon the lilies. Until the day breathes, the shadows flee. I will hie me to the mountain of myrrh and the hill of frankincense. You are all fair, my love, there is no flaw in you," right? Like, so this quote that is part of the Catholic tradition, the Christian tradition, yet it's also part of the erotic tradition of poetry, right? Which again is part of, or points towards those beautiful, like kind of epiphanic moments that the narrator has, which are pretty much a matter of intimacy with her lovers, right? So I think that's something that we need to talk, or it's good to point out also because this character too, and this is something very common in Latin America, when she says, da, 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 yeah, like it's the Colombian saying, or the narrator describing the Colombian, and the narrator says, she pulls a Bible from her big purse and asks me, "Do you know this?" And I say, "I'm Catholic." And she says that well, she was once Catholic too, but then she was saved and became something else, right? She says everything will change for me in the United States as it did for her. So this idea of salvation as a change of religion from Catholicism to Christianity, right? Pretty much something that a lot of immigrants who come from Latin America, especially from areas that are like mostly Catholic, right? Like Mexico being one, they learn about Christianity or Protestantism or like different other denominations, right? And that becomes like another conversion, right? And that goes also with another topic here that I wanted to remark that Jonah touched a little bit, but I wanted to mention it more, which is this idea of salvation, right? Like how very early on this Colombian woman introduces it to her, right? She was saved and became something else, right? Um, and then the father also is saying that Nixon is gonna save them, right? Like he's gonna save them by bringing them back to Cuba, right? Like the father even has a package of like things he wants to take to Cuba. One of them being like Christmas light, which is interesting because kind of like bringing the idea of Christmas as a more like capitalistic notion, right? Right, with spectacle and so on into Cuba. But yeah, I think this notion of being saved as part of changing, right? Like, so I was writing here on my notes how when we're talking about this Colombian, and the Colombian says she was saved and became something else, right? The question becomes here, was she saved and that salvation made her become something else, or it is because she became something else that she was saved, right? So, and that goes back to Jonah's point about the American dream or the American identity, right? Like the idea of like being, as Jonah mentioned, like starting over, right? Like, is this starting over the fact of like becoming an American, right? And that's what makes it a better life, or is it that you get the better life, and that better life is what makes you an American, right? It makes thinking about it in these terms, for example, like it depends on which country you are from that you're going to be allowed to have double nationality or not, right? So if you are from mostly European countries, you can't have a double. You're completely allowed to have a double nationality. You're French American, Italian American, right? I have friends who are that. But if you come, for example, the one that I can tell you is my own, from Mexico, if or when I want to become a citizen, I'm still on a visa right now, but if or when I want to become a citizen, I have to go through a ceremony where I actually renounce, like in front of a judge or a witness, like I renounce the Mexican nationality. I can't have both, right? There is this idea of like think of it philosophically, right? There's this idea of like you can't be an American completely if you still hold on to your Mexican citizenship, right? Yet you can if you have a French citizenship or a British citizenship and so on, right? Why is that? It takes you to very different questions, right? So yeah, so that's another point that I wanted to make. I don't want to make this video too long. I'm almost 17 minutes too. I think the only thing that I wanted to mention is these two things, which are one is an isolated sentence that shows up. There are a few like that. Like one of them, there's three sentences that I want to talk really quickly about. One is there are things that can't be told, right? And that's what Jonah mentioned when we introduced like the bad side of the life in America as an immigrant, right? Like how she has to go to like a special school, or special education track, right? Like how the mother will be profiled and so on. And then there's other sentence that also kind of shows up by itself like that early on, which says, "Is life destiny or determination?" Right? Which is kind of like goes with the way the narrative is created with this prolepsis, right? This fast forward starts in the present, which is the 60s, and then just jumps into the end of their lives, right? Like even the death of the author, or not the author, the narrative voice is expressed when she says that the mother will outlive her as well, right? And the last sentence that I think resounds with that destiny determination as well as the other one is the end, right? When it says, "What none of us can measure yet is how much of the voyage is already behind us," right? So I think that kind of like deals with this idea of not only in America, but every time that you start in a new place, or every time that you start your own voyage, your own trip of life and so on, right? Like how much of what is going to happen is already there, right? So I think that links really well with Jonah's question of the identity, right? Like I think a lot of it is the idea of to become an American is to like have a more malleable identity in many ways, because you are Cuban American, Mexican American, African American, Asian American, and so on, right? But also because you are in this like democratic experiment where you are, and this is the point that she wonders a lot about, you're able to say everything you want. Like the fight with the father, right, comes when she says like, this is a free country, I can do what I want. Do you remember, right? Like, do you remember that supposedly you fought? Like the idea was that you brought me here, you came here for me, right? So that I could do what I want, and now you don't let me do what I want, right? yeah, which is goes into this idea of if you are allowed to do what you want, then to go with the notion of resistance, then what kind of limitations do you have in your identity, right? Like what kind of limitations do you have in changing your identity and being malleable, right? On going beyond beyond genders, on going beyond nationalities, on going beyond cultures, right? And going and passing them over and over again, like you cross the ocean once. Like the whole thing is about is the father and Harris, like they want to go back, right? Um, Even in the Achy Obejas biography on Wikipedia, it mentions that she went back, right? Like this idea of like you are all able to do that too. It's not about just moving and starting over. It's also about being able to do that as well. Anyway, that's my little thing. Sorry it lasted longer than I wanted, but it was just to accompany Jonas. And I hope you guys enjoy it. And yeah, I'll talk to you tomorrow and have a good night, guys.